Oh, how I wish that you could have been there in the 1970s when I was receiving such beauties of music through the incredibly inspirational teaching of Mademoiselle Boulanger. She was not commenting the pieces, she was immersed in them. It was so marvelous to see her give examples on the piano, quasi-blind, as if her fingers were magnetically connected to the notes. And she would play examples of such a different genres. That was so marvelous because it allowed us to exponentially expand our horizons, even if it was because of a fugue from the well-tempered clavier as a departure point, or sometimes of a chorus of a Bach cantata. And then she would give examples of various usages of the circle of fifths as a traveling system for Bach between entrances of the fugue subject or answer during the episodes. And the altered version of this kind of circle of fifths travel through, for instance, the Forlan of the Tombeau de Couperin suite by Ravel, trying to become at that time, when he composed it, a little bit of a what we would call today neoclassical composer, revisiting the tradition of the French clavecinists by writing a suite in which the circle of fifths for the flow of the patterns through the episodes were in fact by diminished fifths instead of by perfect fifths, compared to, let's say, Bach's organ prelude and fugue in D major. Ré, mi, fa, mi, ré, c'est la, c'est, fa, sol, mi, la, sol, la, mi, fa, ré, sol, fa, sol, ré, mi, do, fa, do, ré, si, mi, si, do, la, ré, mi, do, ré, ré. That was, of course, the subject. And in Ravel is la, sol, la, fa, sol, la, mi, sol, fa, sol, ré, sol, ré, fa, ré, mi, fa, sol, la, fa, ré, fa, si, la, si, sol, fa, sol, mi, do, la, si, do. What did it show us? It didn't show us that Ravel was just altering the circle of fifths, as some people used to make fun of Stravinsky in his own neoclassical period, writing music like Brandenburg Concerto for his E-flat major orchestra concerto called Dumbarton Oaks. Mi, si, la, sol, si, fa, si, mi, ré, mi, si, sol, si, fa, si, mi, si, sol, mi, si, sol, mi, si, sol, si, mi. Of course, it is not Bach with wrong notes, as some very, I think, superficial criticisms or Greek colons, but in plastic. That was a statement by Boulez when mocking the neoclassical style of Stravinsky. So Ravel did revisit, perhaps in his own neoclassical way, but what she proved us, I find incredibly meaningful, is that the devices that the composers used to express their musical grammar were in fact universal. And that in fact what you heard was something beyond the stylistic coating, was a communality of that circle of fifths. That was sort of the backbone of the tonal system, which in a way created at its both endings a tritone, which therefore created, like the North and South Pole, a necessity magnetically to be resolved either as a sixth, either as a third, in order to get out of this triton, the devil in music, as the Gregorian monks used to call it, because it called for attention into a resolution whenever the perfect fifths do not. They don't determine major or minor since they're perfect intervals, and they don't have a necessity for resolution because they don't create attention. And so that even in the certain atonal alteration of or customization of the tonal system that happened with Hindu myth, that happened with many composers of the 20th century who were revisiting the classical music tonal system by customizing it for them. César Franck with a drop of minor thirds, Fauré with the plagal cadence, half modal, half tonal, or chromatic but not fully. You could say that these different gimmicks are representations of their visible part of the iceberg that we can recognize them through as soon as we hear them. Parallel triads, especially augmented fifth ones with Debussy, the octotonic with Messiaen, and before that with Stravinsky, and many options where the tone and the semitones had a different order, and their organization was in fact a, I would say, harmonic colorization of the musical statement of the composers. And of course, when it reached the point to which you didn't have anymore the hierarchy of the harmonic degrees between the dominant a fifth over the tonic, the subdominant a fifth under the tonic in the circle of fifths, and not subdominant in the scale arrangement by tetrachords when you go over 1/5 to create step motion, then you have really two poles around the tonic, the subdominant under the fifth and the dominant upper the fifth. And of course the dominant has the leading tone in itself, which creates then the triton with the subdominant, which in C major would be the B and the F. The B the leading tone and the F the subdominant on the chord of the dominant. GBDF creates that tension which defines the tonal system that can be avoided or delayed rather than avoided, though it could be, but by the so-called plagal cadence, no. That's what people often think as an alternative to the perfect cadence, that is the necessity to resolve the triton. But it's when the bass goes, instead of the tonic, to the sixth degree, the deceptive cadence, which then it's like a delayed tactic to not finish right away with the punctuation of the sentence, which would be the perfect cadence. And this type of delayed resolutions, even in the voice leading with suspensions and delayed suspensions between the sixth and the five, the fourth and the third, the seventh and the sixth, you had this variety of textural richness of delaying resolutions, which with the bass line created a sense of provoked dissonances for emotional beauty or emotional aesthetics. If it's in minor, especially painful dissonances, then lament or chaconne or Passacaglia, but also the idea of the chromaticism associated to minor key, since it's mostly semitones, compared to the two parallel tetrachords in major, ton-ton, semitone, which are unequivocally unsubtle because they're the same, and therefore they reproduce each other. You can add one on top and you go from C major with an F sharp in G major, with a C sharp on top of it in D major, and with a G sharp on top of the first two sharps in A major, and so forth. So you have this idea that the major is the simple construction because it's always bright and evident. Whenever the minor has the different variants that come from the modality already back from the Greeks, where you have the descending modes that reach the fifth, the perfect fifth, where the subdominant would be in the tonic system. Tonal system. And so, for instance, the Dorian in E, mi, re, do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, between mi and la, you have the perfect fifth, which would be the subdominant in the scales going up in the tonal system. But they adopt part of the modality by dropping down in minor, the so-called natural minor, or descending melodic minor, do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, which looked from the perspective of dropping, since it's descending, it is ton-ton semitone for the tetrachord. And the tetrachord, ton-ton semitone going up, is the major tetrachord. So in a way, you had the opposite when you went up with the melodic so-called ascendant, where you had ton, semitone, ton, because the third is determining the mode of major minor. And then the top would be ton-ton semitone in major. Do, re, mi, flat, fa, minor, sol, la, si, do, major 6, major 7th, leading tone, octave. And so, in fact, the minor modes that are so-called the melodic ascending, descending, which are in fact modal, at least for the descending one that doesn't have the leading tone since it's descending, and the ascending one that has the top in major and the bottom in minor, we're creating a sense of subtlety in the expression of what is the mood that you create as a composer when you use a minor major, as I call it, halfway, which has a minor 6 with a major third, or minor third with a major sixth in the scale. And so you start realizing that from a very simple but organically universal for the tonal system circle of fifths, of perfect fifths, which on each end touch the tritone that needs to be resolved, both resolutions creating their own triton, and therefore the whole system is locked by that tension. It's almost fascinating to see how then all these alterations of the system make it so much more subtle, to the point to which you forget hearing these I would say, invisible backbones of the tonal system when they're dressed up in a Brahms symphony, in a Tchaikovsky concerto, in a Chopin sonata, in a Schubert lieder, in a Haydn quartet, in a Bach cantata, in a Mendelssohn octet, and all of these people learned their trade on the spot because they studied the music of their time, and they didn't have this universal study time to do, let less access to most. For instance, Mozart didn't study Monteverdi. Who knows what he would have been if he knew him? But at the same time, what you learn through the different styles that you can study today better than ever before, in other words, with more time and more information. And Mademoiselle Boulanger certainly encouraged us when we were composers, at least intending to, or theoreticians, or intending to explain the music to students, or performers like pianists who were there to describe the music through the effect that all this grammar of construction of the syntax gives the eloquence of the different styles, time periods that we can revisit today, which the trade of which was studied only for their own time period, within their time period. And that is fascinating because we realize through her very diverse examples of teaching or studying analytically different time periods, that in fact a lot of them have more in common than the differentiation which their time period colored them in. So when you get to the point to which you realize that, you don't think, oh, they all were the same, or they didn't have enough curiosity to reinvent the system, rethink the order of the fifths, or the order of the tones, because the seven perfect fifths with the chromatics of the sharps or the flats become the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. And so, of course, they have an order. If you have ton, ton, semiton, do, re, mi, fa, and then sol, la, si, do, in the top tetrachord in C major, going up you have the sharps, do sharp, re sharp, and then G sharp, A sharp. Then you obtain with the F sharp dominant of the dominant, you obtain the 12 tones. Do, do, diez, re diez, mi, fa, fa, diez, sol, so, diez, la diez, si, do. And on the way down, you flat. Do, si, la, sol, do, si bemol, or flat, la, flat, sol. And then sol flat 5, you do 5 of flat 2, or if you do fa sharp fa is an exception for secondary dominant, main secondary dominant, 5 of 5, then you go drop down with the fa sharp in the harmonic melodization of the spelling mi flat re flat do. So those 12 tones of the chromatic scale, if you take them and you reshuffle them in an artificial order of your imagination, then you change the complete alphabet order of what becomes syllables and words. And so, yes, then you obtain atonal music or serial music, or a serial atonal organization of the music as a rejection of this centuries of composers expressing themselves either for sacred, either for non-sacred music, or for any kind of type of music usage, for the necessity of having an expression of this artificial but universal language that is not translated always through the syllables. Of course, operas and cantatas and oratorios are all sung with words, with lyrics, but the music language itself vehicled all the emotional outpour or spiritual uplifting through the writing itself, of the gestural intervals to the organized patterns of voice leadings which interact with each other, overlap with each other, and then they organize into what becomes vertically harmonization of chordal systems through superimposed thirds. But in fact, you have to follow them as layers of voicing, especially in octets, sextets, quintets, quartets, where you can follow them in choir, in SATB, or more voices, motets, where, yes, you hear harmonic slices if you stop on a specific cadential note, but in fact you organize them in a flow where each of them have their own melodic line. And so it seems to me very clear that while the system that was initiated with the serialism, which was to in fact take away the hierarchy of the 12 tones from the 7 original fifths through the leading tones abolishment compared to the subdominant or the dominant, is a system of organizing the path through the degrees that in fact harmonically generated melodic lines for centuries, and are recognizable beyond the stylistic coating of music of Monteverdi or of Ravel. And you realize that even if Ravel revisits the circle of fifths of Bach's fugues with altered, diminished or augmented fifths in that Forlan from the suite Tombeau de Couperin, is that they found meaning in expressing their own inner statements of their inspiration without to reinvent the alphabet. But again, Mademoiselle Boulanger was not an ideological teacher about the tonality versus the atonality. She was not really that. People realized that she was advisor composing and conducting with Stravinsky for his works like Dumbarton Ox Concerto, which she premiered. She was the one who had to complete the Fauré Quartet in E minor, which her master on his deathbed asked her with other of his disciples to compose because he couldn't finish it since he was dying. So she was involved in a great amount of trust from a Stravinsky who didn't really admire anybody but himself. Perhaps Debussy, since he's the only composer to whom he dedicated a piece, the symphonies for wind instruments. But he had for Nadia Boulanger the utmost respect, almost probably more than respect, admiration, and I find that to be a fantastic fact that she was a musician who was hearing at the level of the hearing of these composers who invented and reinvented the wheel, so to say, the circle of fifths. Sorry for that unintended pun. But even when Stravinsky went serial, it was differently than Schoenberg when you look at it, but nevertheless he did, and obtained a different result than Schoenberg, for instance. And the idea that the composers were faced with dilemma between tonal or atonal or post-tonal or serial or neoclassical on the way, and she worked with Stravinsky and with Fauré, the one who was her master, the one who was her equal, really, Stravinsky. And then her students, who inspirationally went on their own incredible elevated paths, such as Aaron Copland. You can think that she was at the heart of the compositional sources of these incredibly different people in terms of their musical inspiration and language. And when she was teaching us the universality, at least that's how I felt it, of the language that they used, while becoming so personal in the way they expressed it, was jubilational, really was, because it becomes so obvious that when you have to say something, you find the way to. And if you don't, you can speculate with the rules that can be applied and organize systems, complicate systems to show that your composition language is so innovatively complex, but perhaps covering for a lack of substance to say anything. That's not obliged to say anything. And if you feel that you have to express your own musical world with a tonal system inherited from centuries, that doesn't make you less modern or less daring than somebody who does it through that. And she was so open-minded to all the different techniques of composition, which were at the time intriguing the young composers who were coming to ask for her advice, that by studying the great masters of the very past, like Schütz, like Monteverdi, like the ones who, in fact, were starting to establish the tonal organization more steadily, but were still under the modality of the different ways of organizing the expression of the leading tone, or Thomas Tallis, at the same time as the flat seven with the sharp seven, and creating those dissonances, or realizing how Monteverdi's minor major thirds was an expression of chromaticism way more than major and minor, and how these effects of dissonance and consonance affect differently our understanding, our today's understanding of their music of the time outside of their own way, in their own time capsule, so to say. And Monteverdi and Buxtehude and all these composers through organ, choral, or sacred, like Bach with the cantatas. Oh, you see, I want to share with you the enthused intellectual and musically emotional, both beehive that studying with Nadia Boulanger was. You came out of a class of hers like that, and you felt like injected with some incredibly liberating creative energy. Quite the opposite of what you would think when some austere teacher gives you only rules that you have to avoid this and prepare that and organize this and sound like that. It's not right in the style of. It's define the very arcanes of the gestures that brought them to write what they did. It's like an immersion in the thought processes of these different composers that she was inviting us to explore, to rethink, to open our minds to their different paradigm. I mean, she was an eye-opening teacher, ear-opening teacher. She was drawing lines between time periods that people didn't compare to because they thought they're so antagonistically different and distant. And that gave us a sense of understanding, perhaps not, but of starting to comprehend this incredible universe of music from all centuries. And because of her non-usage of recordings, we had to sing it or play it on the piano combined. And I was at the heart of it for so many, almost 10 consecutive years weekly. And it irrigates even till today my teaching, of course, my playing, my thinking of music, my discovering of new music every day as I can, as I do, as I combine, not in a stereotypical way of I know it all because I've studied it all, not at all. It's the contrary, quite the contrary. You rediscover pieces you thought you knew through students. You think while you retry to play well a piece you've known that you rediscover in different aspects because your capacity of hearing constantly brings your neurons to organize things that you didn't think about, voicing, an imitation, and then you realize that there is so much more in the layers of the beauties of the music that you discover or you already rediscover or you keep rediscovering. That's very humbling, truly. And I think the lady like her who could have said, I know it, she was the one to be very humble when she was describing the pieces for us. Such initiation to humble in marvelment. Yeah. Oh, so much I wish you were there then.